Origin just almost reaction. This is Irish Potato Famine, the Corn Laws. Extra part 2 by the channel extra credits. Yeah, so in the previous part, the first part, we see how, potato famine came from the United States, not from Ireland, which I thought was the case because Ireland is so famous for that. Lots of people fled from the island to United States and everything. Conan O'Brien makes jokes about that all the time. So I thought it was Irish-specific famine, right, that hit Irish a lot. But that wasn't the case. It originated in the United States, and then it spread from Ireland to the whole Europe. But Irish was the, what hit a lot because of how, relations took place between British and Irish people, where, lots of laws and regulations from British people basically constricted Irish to just rely on potatoes. So since they are relying on potatoes so much, and it's a potato famine, so Irish are the one who's gonna get screwed a lot. So it makes sense. So even after the famine, where you'd expect, doesn't matter what the relations are, you'd expect that British people and British people basically would help out the government, right? People in London basically would help out the Irish people, but no, even there they'll care about their politics more than the human lives, which kind of pisses me off, right? I mean, I'm not naive. Politics wins lots of time against lives of people. That's what the world wars are. Nobody cared about the human lives that were taking place in World War One. Nobody cared that. Everybody just cared about their ego. So people in power basically caring about their political agenda more than human lives. It's not so hard to fathom. But the point is, during the crisis, you think that during the crisis, at least, like how we went through crisis, last year, still going on today. So during the times like crisis, at least people put aside things and actually help people, right? But even then, people in London, basically people in power, is gonna, make sure that, Irish people are still struggling, which is fucked up. Let's watch this one. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe. Check out the Rick Sandy, there's a link in the description. Check out the cast place, check out the cards in here. Let's watch it.
London, September 12th, 1845. The press operator runs off issues of the Gardener's Chronicle. Over 6,000 copies, fresh and ready for tomorrow. The editor bursts in, waving a piece of paper. They must stop the presses and insert a front page notice. No, it can't wait until next week. The potato blight has reached Ireland, the notice reads. Crops around Dublin are perishing. It ends with a question. Where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? But everyone knows where it will be, in the embrace of hunger.
Because what we went through last year and still kind of going on today, this is the time which gives you context about some crisis like this, right? Suddenly hearing like there is an actual famine going on in Ireland right now. It hit the Ireland basically. That would be such a panic news, right? Everywhere basically. Only assholes are people in power, the politicians. Otherwise, everybody in the world would be like what the fuck. And they know that Irish relies on potatoes, so that must be a really fucked up time.
2 months later, the Gardener's Chronicle was in the minority when it predicted agricultural disaster. Over the past 2 months, the press sent mixed signals. Some said the potato crop was fine, others that the blight only affected a few counties. So to get a sense of the problem, Prime Minister Robert Peel sent a scientific commission to get solid numbers. Wait, pause the history for just a second. The Prime Minister's name during the potato famine was Peel. No one else thinks that's a little funny? No, I know it's a serious story. Come on, stop looking at me like, fine, you know what, it's fine. I'm sorry.
Dude, it was a crisis. You're getting stuck at the word Peel? Come on.
His name's Peel, though.
Yeah, all right,
now,
we get it.
That commission was in the House of Commons, telling Parliament to expect 80% mortality in the potato crop. They'd devised methods for keeping the blight away from harvested potatoes, but these proved ineffective. The news troubled Peel. In the summer, there had been hints of crop loss, but that was nothing new. Irish potatoes were unreliable. There'd been 16 potato failures since 1800. And when crops failed, tenants couldn't pay their rent. When tenants didn't pay, landlords brought police and troops to throw them off their land. That meant riots and retaliatory livestock killings. It would also mean secret society.
That's just fucked up, right? During the crisis, man, right? During the crisis, at least people should understand that this is not the time to, do harsh things like that. Like a guy cannot pay, throw him off his land. Dude, the guy can't pay because there's a famine going on. Chill out, all right? Once the famine is gone, everything go back to normal. This is not the time for you to do all this shit. That's just inhumane right there.
Societies like the Molly Maguires and White Boys ambushing landlords and middlemen in their carriages. And those previous potato losses were only regional. This was the whole island. Instability worried Peel. A few years before, the Irish Member of Parliament, Daniel O'Connell, who had campaigned successfully against anti-Catholic laws, had set his sights on repealing the Act of Union. O'Connell's outdoor meetings had attracted 500,000 people, and the government had to threaten force to disperse them. Since then, Peel had taken a more conciliatory approach, but famine could upend.
See, I knew it. Conditions like this, a crisis would be the breaking point, right? People like O'Connell will take a chance like this and press the issue, and there will be some kind of a revolt in the Irish people, basically.
Everything. And the reports were bad. Now that it was November and the full harvests were coming in, the scope of the problem was becoming clear. Not even harvested potatoes were safe. In Western Ireland, a poor farmer had...
Wait a second. Alright, amplified a bit volume because this video's volume is much low. I highly doubt people can listen probably, so maybe this will do it.
Western Ireland, a poor farmer had buried his harvested potatoes in a pit, muttering a prayer at how lucky he'd been. No blight. But a few days later, he opened the pit to check them. Half were totally rotten. Panic struck the whole west of Ireland, where the climate was too wet for grain or oats. I cannot describe in language strong enough, read one account, the frightful and awful alarm of the poor people. May God, in his bountiful mercy, avert such a disastrous calamity. Peel had his faults, but inaction was not one of them. The son of a textile industrialist, he was the first prime minister to come from business rather than the aristocracy. He'd risen through the civil service with sheer hard work and a few big gambles. And he was about to gamble again. Ireland would need food, but Peel would have to walk a fine line. He was a Tory, and his Conservative Party were hardcore.
See, the thing is, since he's a businessman, right? Then he can manage things like what should we do to, provide Irish people the food without angering people at home, and he can manage shit here and there.
Or trade protectionists, particularly due to support from grain merchants. Whatever he did, it couldn't undercut or upset the grain market. And then there was the opposition, the liberal Whigs. They were similarly hardcore when it came to free trade economics. They hated any government intervention in the market. So in other words, the Tories wouldn't support bringing in foreign grain because it would cut local merchants' profits, and the Whigs would shoot down any intervention on price. Meanwhile, Daniel O'Connell and a Dublin group proposed their own measures. Forbid turning grain into whiskey, bring in foreign grains, institute public works, and stop exporting Irish grain, beef, and oats to England. Neither party, Peel knew, would stand for that. After all, grain imports were already a sensitive split, as the two parties consistently brawled over the Corn Laws, a series of protectionist measures meant to keep cheap American grain out of the...
Yeah, but can't Peel appeal to the Tories and the Liberals? Like, I understand your point, right? But this is the crisis time. This is not the time to, enforce your ideas. As soon as the crisis is over, we'll go with your, whatever you want. Right now is not the time to, attack like this. There's a crisis going on, right? I mean, during the crisis, there should be something like, relief efforts should be there, regardless of what political agenda people have, right? It should be like, how during the wartime, automatically martial laws applies, right? In certain places, like, whatever is happening now, president has the power, right? Complete president has the power and military has the power because it's time of crisis in the sense of war. So, crisis like this, famine, virus outbreak, things like that. When it comes to relief effort, it should be similar like that. Like party agendas can, have to put aside. At least they have to pass some kind of a law for that. Like during the crisis time, party agendas put aside and relief should be there, right? As soon as the crisis is over, you can go back to what you do. I don't know.
The UK. Oh, by the way, in Britain, corn means grain. Got it? Cool.
What?
Peel had a plan to thread the needle, but it had to stay a secret. He sent an agent to Boston on a mission to buy 100,000 pounds worth of maize or cornmeal. Peel's agents then started shipping it to Ireland on the quiet. His bet was this: since maize didn't grow in Britain and no British merchants traded in it, this wouldn't be a direct intervention in the market. But the shipments still had to be kept secret, or British merchants might freak out about the competition and withhold their shipments to Ireland. The plan wasn't to feed Ireland with cornmeal. It was that cheap cornmeal would keep food prices low. Maize would not be given away, but sold at cost to counties, and paid for by landlords who would fundraise through their own poor relief organizations. The government would then match those funds and deliver the cornmeal from regional food depots. Peel also instituted road building projects where people could earn a wage to buy the cornmeal. It would be revenue neutral. Ireland, he said, must feed Ireland. If that sounds like a convoluted bureaucratic nightmare to you, you are correct. The idea of fundraising was a particularly terrible one. It meant that the poorest...
So Peel was basically, going indirectly to feed the Irish people, right? By going through the landlord, fundraising, building, road building projects, so, people could earn money to buy things. But this is also create really complicated scenario that could backfire, which probably it will. I think he's doing that, to make sure it's, the people in London don't find that out. Like he said, he's trying to avoid, raising issue in London, like why he's selling corn. That's a competition to our food and something like that, like he said. That's why he's doing that, I guess. He's a businessman, so he's seeing all these different paths to achieve his goal. But the more complicated you make something, the more it has higher chance of, hitting you in the back, basically.
Counties got less food aid than the richer ones. Parish priests complained that no one in their county had anything to donate. If they could, they would have already bought food. Irish farmers ended up pawning their few possessions to buy cornmeal. Others had no choice but to sign up for the hard labor of working on the roads. There were logistical hurdles too. Irish infrastructure was dismal, with a minuscule railway network and roads that deteriorated outside major cities. Maize shipments had to navigate those rocky networks to reach rural areas. But even before that, the maize had to be ground into cornmeal, and Ireland only had 2 mills that could accomplish that. And even when people got the cornmeal, they had to learn to cook it properly or else it made them sick. Scurvy, previously unknown due to the potato's high vitamin C content, started cropping up. So people who couldn't get the relief food went hungry, and people who could plunged deeper into poverty, keeping themselves fed. Some even subsisted on spoiled potatoes. There were food riots and a few high-profile attacks on wealthy citizens. In one county, 1,500 Irish farmers turned up, all armed, when a group of British troops arrived to enforce an eviction. But overall, there was no major risings and no mass death. People survived. Peel, however, would not, because his maize and work programs were not the end of his plans. Though a Tory, he'd come around to the free trade views of the liberal Whigs. He disliked the Corn Laws, which kept cheap American grain off the British market, artificially inflating bread prices, and saw in the Irish crisis an opportunity to push for repeal. Now, if it helped Ireland, so much the better. But that was secondary. He would use this famine as a cudgel to beat his opponents with. He took on the Corn Laws, decrying how high tariffs contributed to starvation in Ireland. And he argued that greed, as much as blight, was starving the Irish farmer. And this was explosive. In 1845, the Corn Laws conjured up the same emotional weight that surrounds issues like healthcare and fuel taxes today. Champions of the law predicted that repeal would collapse the agricultural sector, while the repeal camp cast images of a starving British public unable to afford bread. This move pushed Peel out as Prime Minister, but he was back 2 weeks later when the opposition failed to form a government. Long-term, repealing the Corn Laws would prove good for Britain. Cheap food helped fuel the expansion of its industrial base and build its...
Peel, pushed his own agenda, but he was not wrong there, right? He did help out the people. Cheap food is better for everybody, right? It depends on what your views are, right? If you're conservative or liberal, but still, it did help around the people, right? Even if, helping other people was secondary to him, maybe it was not, how do you know? But, if it was secondary to him, it doesn't matter. He did help around the people.
Empire. But it did nothing to help Ireland. In fact, by tying famine relief to the Corn Laws, he'd thrown the Irish poor into a partisan crossfire. Now, members of the pro-Corn Law camp doubted there even was a famine in Ireland. They spun conspiracy theories that Peel had embellished reports of blight in order to galvanize the repeal effort. And this theory gained credence when
All right, so I guess all the conspiracy bullshit and complete denial that goes on even today in the parliaments and things where people absurdly just said, like, did that even happen? Even though something that publicly happened is a public record, politicians argue, did that even happen? I think, that's exaggeration, that's a lies and shit like that. That's not new. That's not new thing. People have been doing that for a long time.
news emerged that the Scientific Commission had overestimated the 1845 crop loss. They had predicted an 80% mortality for the potato, but actually, the figure ended up being about half that. It was still a dire situation, sure, but not the agricultural apocalypse the scientists had sold Parliament. This ugly partisan warfare meant two things. First, an entrenched bloc in Parliament now saw famine relief as a partisan issue, tied to the Corn Laws. And second, it created an impression that reports of crop loss in Ireland were always exaggerated. But the truth boiled down to this. In the future, families would die with empty bellies in Ireland, while in London, politicians would dismiss reports of famine as alarmist. Peel won in the end. On June 29th, 1846...
Look, here's what I'm thinking, alright? People will basically be pissed off at me saying this, but third world countries suffering something like that is understandable, right? Irish people being under the British rule at the time, being part of the Britain at the time, dying because of famine, because they don't have food in their belly, is just fucking atrocious, right? That's just shameful right there. I mean, how does that happen, right? If something like that happened, a few centuries ago in India, I understand that. Something happened like that in Africa, I understand that. But in Ireland, because of famine, you can't even protect your own. Families die because they're hungry. How the fuck that happens? I mean, that's just shameful right there.
As his cornmeal deliveries were finally in full swing, he crossed the aisle and voted with the opposition, repealing the Corn Laws once and for all. But he got to enjoy his victory for less than 24 hours. Because the next day, both parties revolted and threw him out of power. The Whigs took over, high on their victory. And Peel's relief program, which had let the Irish poor barely scrape by through the first year of the crisis, came under the full control of a civil servant named Sir Charles Trevelyan. His first act was to cancel the food shipments.
His name starts with the Sir. Of course this was going to happen.
After all, the task was done. Next year's crop was about to come in. But the 1846 crop was a total failure. And the bad times, the Great Hunger, were about to begin.
What? Oh, God. See, this is why people say I hate politicians, and I understand, right? Politics is important in our culture. Every time you hear instances like that where people care about their partisan bullshit, their political agendas, and don't care about lives that are being lost. Entire family starves and dies in Ireland. This is Europe, right? The continent of Europe. This is part of, British Empire at the time, right? And they are dying because of one famine. This is just shameful. Alright people, that was Irish Potato Famine, the Corn Laws for the channel extra credits. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the Rick Sunday, there's a link in the description. Check out the cards for place, check out the end card, and yeah, I'll see you next time.